So let's actually create some objects or classes. Start Visual Studio and create a new project. Make sure we're in Visual C#, Windows Desktop, and then choose the console application. We're just going to call it Playground. Okay. So it's created us a very basic project here. We've got a class called Program and we've got a single method. Don't worry too much about that at the moment. What we want to do is create our own class so that we can examine how it's made up. So the first thing we're going to do is we say class, because we're creating a class. We need to give it a name, so we shall call it my object, and then we need these brackets. So within the context of our object, we can define properties and methods. So first of all, let's call a property. So we'll have a string property, and we will call it my string property. Again, we have the open and close brackets, and in here we define what are called getters and setters. The most basic we can have is get and set. And what this allows us to do is simply assign a string value to that property or get a string value from that property. The other thing we might want is a method. Now, a method might return a value or it might not. If it doesn't return a value, we start with void and then we give it a name. And then we do a normal brackets, and in here we can define whether it's going to receive any input. So for example, we could send a string in, or we could send a string and an integer in, and then within the actual method itself we can do something with those. So if we then have our curly brackets, we're now within the body of the method itself, and as you can see, we can now access these parameters that we are sending in, and the IntelliSense is bringing it up with us because it tells us we can access them. If we were to take these out, it's not appearing because it's no longer a valid property. Similarly, a method might actually want to return a value. For example, it might want to return a string. Again, you'll see now that we've got an error, and that's because it's expecting something within the construct of this method to return something. To make it return something, we simply use the return keyword. So for example, return, and that's going to make it return a string, call some value. To actually start using that object, if we go up to our main program, what we're going to do is use something, a command called console, that allows us to output something to the screen. So what we're going to do, first of all, we're just going to have console.readline, open and close brackets because it's actually a method that doesn't receive anything, and press return. Now all that's going to do, it's going to sit there and wait for the user to type something in. So let's just start it to see exactly what's going to happen. Click start, and as you can see, it simply gives us a blank command line, and when we press enter, it finishes the program. I'm just going to zoom this in so we can see things a bit better. So now we've got that. What we want to do, obviously there's no point reading anything if it's not displaying any data, so what we want to do is we want to output some text to that console box. So what we're going to do, we're going to create an instance of my object. So what we need to do is we need to say my object. So we are basically defining a variable that is based on my object. This is similar to if you were to type string, some string equals some value, but instead of using string we're using our own object, and we need to say, give it a name for the variable, then we need to say equals new my object and open and close the brackets. So what this is doing, it's creating an instance of a my object class. We're calling it my object. We'll notice we've used lowercase because Visual Studio is case sensitive, so these are actually two different things, and this is fairly common programming practices when you do this. And then we say new class of my object, and then we have the open curly brackets. Now the reason why they're empty is because in our class itself we don't have something called a constructor. We'll come to that in a minute. So what we can now do is use this object. The first thing I forgot to do is, if we try to use this object at the moment, so if we type my object and then put dot, you'll see that we can't actually access any of these properties, and that's because we've not declared them as public. So what we need to do is make both this method and this property public. So now when we go up to the my object and press full stop, we can now see the my string property and the my method. So what we will do is we will say console.writeLine. So this is going to output something and it wants text. If we click this little arrow here, we can see the different things, the different inputs or different parameters that it's expecting in, and one of those will be string. So we can say my object dot my method, and again we need the open and close brackets with nothing in because our actual method doesn't take anything there. And then when we run that, as you can see, we're outputting the my value that's come from our object. Press any key and it will quit the program. So let's do something a bit more complex here. Let's have instead of a string property, let's have two integers. And what we shall also have is a method that returns an integer. We'll call it calculate. Now what we're going to do is we're going to return number 1 plus number 2. So now within our object we can set these numbers. Oops, number 1 equals 10. Number 2 equals 5. And in our write line we shall simply say number 1 is, so this is passing in some straight text, and then we're going to add to that my object, and we're just going to reference the actual properties. So these aren't doing any calculations, these are just the base properties. So let's just copy that a couple of times, and we shall change that to number 2, and then we shall say the calculation is, and now we're going to call the calculate method. So as you can see, we're assigning numbers to these two properties, and then we're calling the calculate method that's going to add the two numbers together. And as you can see, number 1 is 10, number 2 is 5, and the calculation is the calculation itself. Now, rather than have to manually input these numbers into these variables here, instead what we might have is, in our calculate method, we might want to take the inputs. So instead of doing that, let's remove these. We'll just comment them out. That's going to break these. So we'll just comment them out. And this time we're going to take inputs within here. So input int number 1 and int number 2. Now in our calculate method we want to physically just send in the numbers. So rather than assign them to internal properties within the object, we're just assigning them to as parameters within the method. And again, when we run that, it just outputs the result.